but it's light in here. Thank you, Hashem. Thank you, Hashem. It's dark outside, but it's light in here. Thank you, Hashem. Thank you, Hashem. Aneda Salah, L'Kodesh Hashem. Aneda Salah, L'Kodesh Hashem. Aneda Salah, L'Kodesh Hashem. Kodesh, Kodesh Hashem. Aneda Salah, L'Kodesh Hashem. Aneda Salah, L'Kodesh Hashem. Aneda Salah, L'Kodesh Hashem. Kodesh, Kodesh Hashem. Ay, 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 did I die, die, you die, you die, die, you die, die, die. I die, die, you die, 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 you die, you die, die.
Da da die, die, die. It's dark outside, but it's light in here. Hanukkah is here. That is Zusha on the Thank You Hashem channel on YouTube. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's the 8th day of Hanukkah. That's called Zois Hanukkah. Very special day. Let's light up the darkness. We say a Guten Erev Shabbos because Shabbos starts tonight. But right now, it's the last day of Hanukkah. And that is a time to break through, break all barriers. We've been sharing on the page every day of Hanukkah that the Berditchever Rebbe said each day of Hanukkah has its own unique spiritual power. There are good intentionalities, what to pray for on each day of Hanukkah. The first 7 days relate to the 7 days of the week. God created the world in 6 days. On the 7th day, God taught us to rest and to appreciate, to acknowledge the creation, to enjoy it, to be grateful for it. So 7 days represents this natural world, the universe. The 8th day is beyond this world. It suggests, it has that scent of infinity. Everything is possible, and that's why Hanukkah, the festival of miracles, in Kislev, which begins the month, we've already come out of Kislev, we're in a new month because the month changes in the middle of Hanukkah, but still Kislev was called the month of miracles. Now, the last day of Hanukkah, the 8th day, the day of miracles. If you need a miracle in your life, the Ruzhiner Rebbe says this. I heard it from Rav Kalmanson here in LA this morning. The Ruzhiner Rebbe said that an ordinary person can pray and can achieve with his prayers or her prayers on the 8th day of Hanukkah what even a great tzaddik, like a saintly righteous leader, like not just a rabbi, but a tzaddik, one of the great saintly leaders of the world, what a tzaddik can't even achieve with his prayers on Yom Kippur, the ordinary person can achieve on the 8th day of Hanukkah. Why? Because the treasury of Hashem, the treasury of God, the doors are open today. Right? So if there's something that you must have, something you need, particularly strong on this day, to pray for barren parents, people who are trying to have a child, haven't been able to have a child, very strong for them to pray for themselves and others to pray for them today. If you've been looking for your beshert, your soulmate, for a long time, today is the day to pray for that. Somebody needs a healing, a miraculous healing. Today, pray for that. Very powerful, our prayers today. And so we can say Hag Hanukkah Sameach, a joyful for breaking through to the supernatural miracles that power is contained in the 8th day of Hanukkah. Today's AT Daily, where are we holding? This is Daf Chaf Zayin, page 27 of Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the Laws of Passover. page 27. We're in chapter 2, still discussing the first Mishnah. Today's class is dedicated, got a couple dedications. Arnie Hertz is dedicating today's class in honor of Sal and Nina Litvak for the great work you are doing. Thank you so much, Arnie. Thank you for supporting our nonprofit. May you and your family be blessed with unlimited health, sweetness, joy, meaning, and prosperity in the year ahead. And we say amen. Also, Zaki Westridge here in LA is dedicating today's class. He's got a beautiful dedication in honor of all the Jews all over the world that are dealing with the normal stresses of life. I love Zaki's dedication because he's saying, you know what? We're all dealing with these intense challenges for COVID. Okay, we are. And please God, that vaccine should be successful. It should come out soon. We should all get it and we should come out to the other side. But even then, we'll return to a life that wasn't so perfect, right? Even in ordinary times without a plague, life is not so perfect. May we realize, right, when we come out of a plague, how good we have it, even when it's tough, and that we should be able to deal with all the stresses that everybody has. Nobody's life is free of stress, free of challenge. We all have our burdens to bear. But may we realize that God gives us the tools, and our ancestry and our heritage and the wisdom of our ancestors is there for us, and we can choose to find joy and meaning in the world, even in the midst of our burdens, and that will ease our stress. Thank you, Zaki. May you and your family be blessed with unlimited health, joy, sweetness, meaning, and prosperity in the coming year. And we say amen. Okay. If you would like to sponsor a class, we're halfway through December. This is our annual campaign. We made it a month-long drive. We are at 52% of our goal. So on this, the day of miracles, when you are praying for a miracle in your life, very good to attach some of your hard-earned income to a nonprofit that is dedicated to sharing Torah with the world, lighting up the world with the ancient wisdom of the Jewish people, and it's reaching so many people. So your dollars have tremendous impact. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. It also says there how you can dedicate a show, but all donations are intensely welcome. They help us make up our budget for the coming year. Would love to see you participate and partner with us. Okay, so where are we? The Mishnah that we've been discussing now for a week, the first Mishnah in chapter 2, it's talking about when chametz, leaven, becomes prohibited to eat on the morning before Passover begins. It also becomes prohibited for benefit. We've been discussing the relationship between prohibited for eating and prohibited for benefit. It also said in that Mishnah that one may not even light one's oven with it, right? You destroy the chametz, and you destroy the chametz, the leaven products, and you destroy them by burning. You don't have to burn it. As we saw, the sages said you could also crumble and scatter in the ocean or scatter in the sea. So whatever chametz is left in your possession, while it was still permitted to benefit from it, you could have sold it to a non-Jew, and then it would be removed from the possession of a Jew. But once you can't sell it anymore, it has to be burned, whatever's left, or scattered, right? Or scattered. But while we're burning it, one might ask, well, can I light my oven with it? Right? Can I light my oven with this chametz? And the Mishnah said no, because that would be a benefit. And at this point, we cannot benefit from it at all. When we're destroying it, even by burning, it's to destroy it, not to get some benefit from that process of destruction. Now, we're going to be talking quite a bit about burning in an oven today. And it's a very interesting discussion. I think you're going to enjoy it. But let's just explain what an oven was in the ancient world. Obviously, it's not a stovetop range where you go in and either you have a gas burner or an electric burner, and you just turn that on and boom, you've got heat in the oven and you can put your pizza in there. In the ancient world, much more like, there's some pizzerias today that have these traditional, I forget which part of Italy. Somebody can put it in the comments, right? It's some kind of traditional, wood-fired oven. I think there's definitely some, what's the word I'm looking for? Artisanal pizza places, right? That are going to fire their pizzas like this. But an oven in the ancient world was made out of clay, made out of earthenware. It's just kind of this large structure, and then you have a big fire inside the oven, heat up that whole oven, and in some cases you leave some of the coals burning and you put your food in there. In other cases you might even remove the coals and just use the heat that has been, you've heated up the clay super hot, and you can bake bread in there. They would put, bread was much more like a flat bread, more similar to pizza dough today than what we consider, really puffy bread. But at any rate, they might put some of that flat bread, even stick it to the sides of the clay oven. But the important thing to remember is it's a clay oven. It's usually some kind of a domed structure. It's got an opening that can be closed, and they put some kind of a hole in the top, I imagine, for the, I don't know. I don't know how it works. But at any rate, there's a fire inside this dome-shaped clay oven. So when we're talking about lighting the oven, we're talking about the fire is not under the oven, it's inside the oven, right? That's the important point about that. Okay, so we have a baraisa which teaches that if you kindle that fire inside the oven with prohibited objects, which are prohibited for benefit, as we have discussed, not just prohibited for eating, but prohibited for benefit. In this case, the examples that are mentioned are going to be the peels of orla and straw of kalayim. The peels of orla, so this means fruit that was harvested from a tree in its first 3 years. A Jew is not permitted to eat fruit harvested from a tree until it is 4 years old. The first 3 years, you let the tree grow. We don't eat that fruit. It is considered set aside, not permitted to a Jew. So we can't eat those fruits, and we can't benefit from them. That's what we've been discussing the last few days. Prohibited to eat, also prohibited for benefit, unless the Torah specifies otherwise. So if you use the peels of such fruit as kindling to get that fire going, we have a problem. Likewise, straw of kalayim. So this is going to be like straws made from grass, some kind of grain or long grassy type plants. And if they were planted in a vineyard, for example, so you can't grow, your grass for purposes of making straw, which usually is fed to animals or used in other ways. You can't grow that in the midst of a vineyard, right? That's the prohibition, the Torah's prohibition on planting diverse kinds together, the prohibition on kalayim. So if you have this straw, which is prohibited for benefit, or these peels of orla, which are prohibited for benefit, and you use them to kindle a fire inside the oven, which is a benefit to you, so you have violated this prohibition. The question is, then what? Okay, so then what happens to this oven? So the first thing that we're going to hear is, if this is a new oven, this is the first time it's getting fired up. So now this fire, which was created by prohibited matter used as kindling, now has been used essentially to finish the production of the oven. Because the first few times, or the first time at least, that this clay oven gets fired like that, when it's a new oven, so burning that wood super hot inside helps harden the oven, right? It's like the oven is complete. The wood, the clay is dry. It looks like an oven, acts like an oven. It doesn't talk like an oven, but it's like an oven. It is an oven. But the fact is, when the first few times, or at least the first time that you fire it up, it's actually going to make that clay harder. It's going to make it more firm. It's going to contribute to the manufacture of that oven. And if you did that with prohibited wood, or with a fire that was kindled by prohibited products like the peels of orla or the straw kalayim, the oven was there. Therefore, its manufacture was aided in part, even at this last stage of its manufacture, with benefit from a prohibited substance. And the oven needs to be smashed according to this Baraisa. According to a Baraisa contemporaneous with the Mishnah, not quite as authoritative as the Mishnah. In this case, we'll understand why. The Baraisa continues, if it was an old oven, meaning it's already had many fires in it, got hot, cooled, got hot, cooled. Okay, so now when you fire it up, that's not going to affect how hard the walls of the oven are. We're not involved in the manufacture of the oven anymore. The oven's finished. It's been finished for a long time. So now this fire that was prohibited, that was lit by a prohibited substance, it doesn't affect the oven itself. We can just allow the oven to cool, get fully cold, go back to square one, and build a new fire from permitted substances, and then we can continue using the oven. But if it was a new oven, according to this Baraisa, we're supposed to smash the oven. It can never be used because its manufacture was made in part by the prohibited substance. The halacha, the law, I'll just give us a sneak peek right now, disagrees with this Baraisa. Eventually, the sages established that opinion, that this oven needs to be smashed because the fire that was kindled with the prohibited substance contributed to its manufacture, too stringent. And the sages said, no, that's too much. In fact, all we have to do is let that oven cool down all the way and then build another fire, and we can continue using the oven. We don't have to smash the oven. But the next question is, if while there was this fire in the oven, old or new, that was kindled using prohibited substances, and now bread was baked in the oven. Aha. So this is an oven that was either heated by or strengthened by the prohibited items. What about the bread? Okay, we don't have to smash the oven. What about the bread that was baked in this oven with the help of the heat from that fire? So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says prohibited. We cannot eat that bread. We cannot benefit from that bread. The rabbis who disagree with Rabbi say permitted. We can eat that bread. We can benefit from that bread. And all agree that if what we're talking about is the coals of that fire, meaning we created the fire burned for a while, and all that's left in the oven is the coals of that fire. So imagine like your fireplace has been running for a while. You stop feeding it wood. An hour later, there's still heat in that fireplace. If you were to stir the coals, there would even be some glowing coals inside the gray ash. If it's at that point that you introduce the dough that is going to be baked into bread, so everyone agrees that bread is going to be permitted because really it's being baked by a hot oven. The oven got hot with a fire that was originally kindled with prohibited substances. But at this point, those substances are long gone, right? The fire, now we're just in the coal stage of that fire. So it would seem that what Rebbe is prohibiting is just bread that's baked when the fire itself is still burning. And so then the question is why? What is the basis of this disagreement between Rebbe and the sages, the rabbis who disagree with him? So we're going to see what is the difference, why. But before we get there, to understand what is the difference between them, the Gemara brings another Baraisa, and this is the lenient Baraisa that the halacha, the law, was eventually established after, that whether the oven is old or new, there's no need to shatter the oven, right? So that's a lenient Baraisa that disagrees with this first, more stringent one with respect to the oven itself, and this is the one that we follow. You don't need to smash the oven. But it does definitely disagree with the first Baraisa. So the Gemara asks, well, what is they're so contradictory, how do we get there? And the Gemara answers its own question, la kasha, it's not a difficulty. The Baraisa which says we have to shatter the oven is going according to Rebbe, right? Who says it's prohibited to eat the bread that was burned in that was fired, that was heated, baked by when the wood was burning, that was kindled with the prohibited substance. And the permitted and the lenient Baraisa goes after the opinion of the rabbis who say that this bread, even that was baked by that wood, while it was burning, wood that was kindled with a prohibited substance, even while it was burning, we can eat that bread. Right, so with respect to the oven, it would seem that one brisa follows the opinion of Rebbe, that it's prohibited with the bread, and likewise the oven, and the other one seems to follow the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rebbe and permit the bread that was baked by that fire, and likewise permit the oven to live, as it were. They don't smash it, even in the case of a new oven. The Gemara objects and says, whoa, wait a minute. But Rebbe only permits when the kindling of this fire used prohibited wood. And so what the Gemara is getting at here is now we're trying to break down, okay, what is between Rebbe and the rabbis? What exactly are they disagreeing with? So it seems that what Rebbe says is that this wood that was burning, that was kindled with a prohibited substance, so it's like that prohibited substance is still in the fire while it's burning, and now it was used to bake the bread, and it was used to harden the oven if it was a new oven. So the reason that Rebbe prohibits is because there was improvement from the prohibited substance. Now that's actually a principle, right? That's a defined term. Improvement from the wood in this case, or from the prohibited substance, right? So the prohibited substance caused the bread to be baked. The prohibited substance caused this new oven to harden. But there's a different principle which may be at work here, and that is caused by both this and this. These are different principles, right? So if the prohibited substance created improvement, some will say, for that reason alone, we're going to prohibit the result of that process. The different principle is there were two contributing factors to the production of this thing. Some of it was prohibited, some of it was permitted. In that case, one sage or some sages will say prohibited because there was even a contribution from something. And other sages will say when there's this combination in place, it's going to be permitted because you can't attribute the formation fully to the prohibited substance. So this bread that was baked in the presence of a fire kindled with a prohibited substance, was it improved by the wood, improved by the prohibited substance, or was it created by both this and this, by both a prohibited and a permitted contribution to its manufacture, in this case, to its baking? If we're talking about caused by both this and this, now, who permits that? The rabbis. The majority permits that. Who prohibits the product of something which is both this and this? Rabbi Eliezer. It's not Rebbe, not Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, also known as Rebbe. It's a different sage. It's Rabbi Eliezer. What did Rabbi Eliezer say? We learn Rabbi Eliezer's opinion regarding this principle of caused by both this and this from the case of Leaven. Very interesting. It doesn't mention this in the translation in the Koran, but I think the way I imagine this is sourdough. Okay, so sourdough, it's not like I understand baking and baking bread so well, but I'm familiar that, right, where does sourdough come from? Or it's been around for a long time. But sourdough, the concept is you don't add a new packet of yeast every time you make this bread, right? The idea with sourdough is like you actually use leftover dough from the last time you made bread and carry some yeast in it already and add it to the new batch of dough, and that's going to cause it to rise, right? So it's like you're actually using dough to make other dough rise because the sourdough carries within it the leaven that is going to be necessary for the new dough to rise, right? So using old leaven to create new leaven, basically. Okay, so we have a case where the existing sourdough, right, the existing dough that has leaven in it, that has what to make the new bread rise, that we have two batches. One batch of this sourdough is chulin, meaning non-sacred. It's just regular regular dough, in this case, regular sourdough. And the other batch is teruma. So teruma we've encountered a bunch of times. Teruma is that portion of your produce that you set aside for the use of a priest only. Once it's consecrated for the priest, it's part of the tithing process. Once it's consecrated as teruma, only a Kohen, a priest, and his family and his household may eat of it. The average Jew may not, right? So now we have these two batches of sourdough. Some of it is mundane, right, is non-sacred, and some of it is teruma, is consecrated for the use of the priest. Some of each falls into the batch of new dough. Enough, the combination is enough to make the new dough rise. But neither the non-sacred sourdough nor the sacred sourdough was enough by itself to make the new dough rise. Only the combination was enough. So here we clearly have that case of the new dough is caused to rise by the combination of both this and this. Neither alone would have caused the new dough to rise. It's this combination of non-sacred and sacred. Now, the issue with the sacred is if you use sacred dough, teruma, to make the new dough rise, so then the new product you would think is going to be consecrated, right? It's not for the average person to eat. Only a priest is going to be permitted to that. For everyone else, it's going to be prohibited. So that's the question. Is this new batch prohibited to a non-priest? Now, here we have a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the other rabbis, the majority who disagree with him. Rabbi Eliezer says, I follow the last. What does he mean? He says, well, we two batches fell in, right? The new dough is going to be made to rise by receiving both non-sacred and sacred dough. In this case, we know which is which. We know that it received only enough in combination for the new dough to rise. Rabbi Eliezer will say, whichever went in last, meaning if it was a combination of non-sacred and sacred sourdough that went in, if it's the sacred sourdough that went in last, well, until that sacred sourdough went into the mix, the new batch was not going to rise. So the final blow that was struck, right, the thing that finally made it possible for this flat bread to become bread, to rise, is that last bit of sacred sourdough that was added to the batch. So here, Rabbi Eliezer would prohibit the new bread from being eaten. And the sages say this new batch is going to be permitted until there's so much of the sacred sourdough that it would have made the bread rise just from the amount of sacred sourdough. So in other words, if it's a combination of some non-sacred and some sacred sourdough, and that combination together is the minimum amount that's going to make the new batch rise, the rabbis will permit that. So even though it's caused by both this and this, it's going to be permitted until it's essentially caused to rise only by the sacred. Rabbi Eliezer is going to go after the last. So if the sacred sourdough was the last to go in, and there's not enough to make it rise by itself, but it is so in combination with the non-sacred, and it went in last, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say prohibited. So that's where they diverge. And we see that in this case, where it went in last, Rabbi Eliezer is holding by where both this and this caused together, the new batch is going to be prohibited. Okay. So now we have a Mishna which says, what if we're talking about not wood from not peels of orla, just the peels of this fruit that came from the first 3 years, or straw from kilayim, straw that was grown in a vineyard and in a prohibited mixture of diverse kinds, but rather wood from a tree used for idolatry, wood from an Asherah. So we've discussed this recently. An Asherah was a tree that was worshipped by people in the Canaanite region who viewed it as some kind of a fertility goddess, brought offerings to the trees that they worshipped, etc. This is avodah zarah, prohibited idolatry with the strongest possible prohibition. Idolatry in the Torah is the highest level of sin on a level with murder and rape. So wood from this Asherah tree, absolutely prohibited for benefit, and it's going to be a super stringent prohibition. So this Mishnah teaches that if such wood was burned in an oven, if it's a new oven, it has to be shattered. If it's an old oven, okay, so it didn't contribute to the manufacture of the oven. You certainly can't cook with that. So you have to let that, get that fire out of there, get all the ashes out of there, let the oven cool down all the way again, and then you'll be able to continue using the oven with a new fire. If bread was baked by a fire made of the wood of the Asherah tree, the idolatrous tree, the subject of idolatry, so that bread is going to be prohibited for eating or for benefit, according to this Mishnah. Here's the question. If that bread so bread was baked by wood of an Asherah, so now there's going to be benefit from wood that was used for idolatry. The benefit is the form of bread gets baked from that fire. The dough is baked in the presence of that burning fire. And now that bread is certainly prohibited, but the issue is that loaf comes out, and you can imagine this was like maybe a big bakery, right? So it's not just a home oven, but let's say it's a professional bakery, and they've got a row of these ovens, and they're making lots of bread, and some Asherah wood went into one of the ovens. They only discovered that after. All the other ovens are fine. All the other bread is fine. They discovered it quickly, but one of those loaves that was baked in the oven fired by Asherah wood now gets intermingled with all these other loaves, right? This is a big financial commitment of the baker. So the question is, now we don't know which of those many loaves was baked in this prohibited manner and became a prohibited loaf. Now the prohibited loaf is intermingled with a whole bunch of permitted loaves. What happens then? And the answer is that all the loaves become prohibited. Like, that is how strong the prohibition on the product of idolatry is. We distance ourselves from idolatry to a total extent, right? But this is a huge loss for the baker. I mean, this is a disaster for him. Particularly, you can imagine that he's baking challahs, and all the Jews are coming from the town. This is going to be their Friday night challahs. Maybe for whatever reason people aren't baking them at home. Disaster. But says Rabbi Eliezer, there's actually a fix. There is something you can do. Rather than render all these loaves prohibited and then you have to throw them all out. What can you do? You can designate the value. It's actually a very nice fix. You can designate the value of what you know to be prohibited. That was just one loaf. Or maybe there were 10 loaves that came out of this one oven that used the idolatrous tree in it. But whatever is the monetary value of the bread that was baked in the prohibited oven, before you realize it was prohibited, you set the fair value of those loaves, and then you designate money in that amount, and now you have to basically sacrifice that money. Now, what you're doing is you're transferring the prohibition of that bread from the bread to this money. You're still going to take a loss, but at least you're only taking a loss on the prohibited loaves themselves and not on the whole inventory that they became intermingled with. What do you do with that money? Now that money is basically the product of idolatry, right? You've transferred the value from the prohibited loaves to this money. You can't go spend that money in the marketplace. You can't even give it away as charity. That money has to be removed from circulation in the same way that you would have when you had the prohibited loaves and you would have just burned them up. So what do you do with that money? You throw it in the Dead Sea. That's a different Mishnah, but what our discussion is learning from that Mishnah is that Rabbi Eliezer does prohibit the whole mixture unless it's redeemed, right? So this whole mixture, which includes in it just a little bit of what's prohibited and a lot of what is permitted, he's going to agree that that whole mixture is prohibited unless you take advantage of this procedure of transferring what's prohibited to the value of money and getting rid of the money. The Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, by the way, says that cure doesn't work. There's another rabbi who says that doesn't work. You can't redeem the product of idolatry through a financial tool like that, and you would have to destroy all of the inventory. So that I think we follow Rabbi Eliezer in the case of that Mishnah. At any rate, the idea of it's Rabbi Eliezer who says a prohibition caused by both this and this, something prohibited and something permitted together, that's Rabbi Eliezer who holds like that. He prohibits when both this and this cause. Now let's go back to our original dispute. Rebbe, who said that the bread baked in this fire that was kindled with peels of orla or straw of kalayim, the peels of fruit from a tree in its first 3 years, or straw grown in a vineyard, was prohibited to do so. And he said that bread is prohibited. Is he prohibiting that bread because it was caused by both this and this? No. Rebbe was prohibiting because it was improved by something that was prohibited. Right? So what he's going to say, explains Abaye, is Rebbe was talking, and this is why we had at the beginning of that dispute that all agree that the bread was baked by the coals of this fire that was kindled with a prohibited substance. That bread is going to be permitted. So what we're talking about is bread that's baked in the presence of the fire itself. While the fire is still burning the wood in the oven, that's when you bake the bread. So Rebbe would say that bread actually contains little tiny, subatomic particles of the fire that had the prohibited substance in it. It's not about both this and this. That fire contained the prohibited substance, and that is what fired the bread. And so that's the principle that Rebbe was relying on to prohibit the bread. And it's going to be the same principle for if in that oven you fired pots or vessels or goblets made out of earthenware. We're not talking about glass, but if we're talking about utensils and vessels made out of clay, so then they would have been, and you did that with this fire that was kindled with a prohibited substance, those vessels would be prohibited as well. Not because created using both this and this, but rather improved by the prohibited substance. So then the Gemara asks, okay, well, what about the coals of the Asherah? Right? Since we're talking about coals are different than the fire itself, and the coals would be permitted, are we permitted to bake bread in this oven when only the coals of the idolatrous tree remain in it? The fire has, died down. It's still hot in there because of the coals of the Asherah tree. Some say you actually could use that fire, but only when the coals have become dim, right? When it's really just kind of hot gray ash in there. Others say even while the coals are glowing. At that point, it becomes permitted to use it because it's no longer an Asherah tree. And some will even say you can use that bread that was baked in front of the fire of the Asherah tree, the idolatrous tree. Why? Because you're actually fulfilling the commandment of destroying the Asherah tree when you burn it. And so at that point, that fire does become available for benefit, like to bake this bread. Definitely not everybody holds that way, just some say that. But according to the ones who allow bread to be baked even by the fire of the idolatrous tree, so then what remains that is prohibited about the Asherah tree? Like you obviously can't, worship the tree, You're not going to be allowed while the tree is alive, to make use of it in any way. But presumably this tree has been chopped down. So if you can actually burn it to bake bread, according to that opinion, what is it that you're prohibited to do? And says Rav Ami Bar Chama, you can't make furniture out of it, right? So the example he specifically uses is a stool. You can't make a stool out of an Asherah tree. It's been killed when you cut it down. It's no longer alive. And then you totally turned it into a new thing when you make a stool out of it, and very often transforming an object into a new object. For example, when it comes to tuma, to impurity, it will remove the impurity when you transform an object into something new. But when we're talking about a tree that was used in Avodah Zarah, in idolatry, no. It must be burned. And then according to some opinions, you can bake bread while it's burning. But we all agree that you can't take that tree that was used for idolatry and make furniture out of it and then use the furniture. Now, with regard to the rabbis who permitted bread baked in the fire that was kindled with those peels of orla or the straw of kilayim, with regard to that opinion, Rami Bar Chama asked Rav Chisda, so what about bread that was baked in an oven with a fire that was kindled not by a prohibited substance because somebody violated the Torah when he took fruit from a tree in its first 3 years, or harvested this straw that was grown in a prohibited mixture of straw grown in a vineyard, but rather from Kodesh, wood that was consecrated for use in the temple. Now here, this gets very interesting, right? We started to talk about this yesterday, and I mentioned it in the description of yesterday's show, that when you have the wood of an Asherah, for example, okay, so this is the highest form of prohibition. This wood was used for idolatry. We can never benefit from it in any way because it is so unholy, right? It is so unholy. On the other hand, we have wood that was consecrated for use in the temple. For example, it would be a fire on the altar where sacrifices, these incredibly holy animals that were set aside to be sacrificed in the temple, and this is the wood that was going to be part of that fire. So this kind of wood is now consecrated to be at the highest level, the most holy level. What's interesting is whether, set aside because of unholiness, because it was used for idolatry, or set aside because of holiness, because it's going to be used for the altar in the holy temple. In both cases, this wood is prohibited, right? So it's very interesting that on either end of the spectrum, the result is the same: prohibited for benefit. We can't use it, we can't touch it, we can't, benefit from it in any way for ourselves. The middle is where all of us live, right? What's mundane, what is neither holy nor idolatrous, what is simply non-sacred, that's what we can use, right? So really the opposite of holy is mundane. The opposite of holy is not unholy, right? These are two extremes that are not really opposites because they end up in the same place of set aside, not available for use. So the question that's being asked now is, well, what if we fired this oven with wood that had been set aside for use in the temple? Can we eat that bread? That's the new question. Not because it was wood that was, worshipped in some way by idolaters, but rather wood which a Jew set aside, donated to the temple so that it could be used in the temple, or even that the temple purchased, right? The temple purchases it for its needs. And at any rate, this wood became set aside to only be used for firing consecrated offerings in the temple, and now is being used for a mundane purpose as a fire in an oven just to bake bread. Definitely prohibited. You might, perhaps for the priests teruma when they're baking their bread in the temple, but that's not what's going on here. So holy wood being used for a mundane purpose of baking bread. What happens to that bread? Answer, prohibited. Absolutely prohibited according to all opinions. Even according to the rabbis who said that the fire kindled by the prohibited substances, the peels of orla or the straw of kilayim, would be permitted because that fire is not really in it. Well, actually, they said even in the presence of the fire, they would permit that. But even they would prohibit bread baked using this consecrated wood. And the question is why? Because orla, let's say the case of orla, products of trees in their first 3 years, they can become mebatal, they can become nullified in a mixture of 1 in 200. Right, so if you have this product of orla, but it gets mixed in a greater quantity of things where it's more than 200 to 1, so then it's considered nullified and it no longer has any effect, and it doesn't in some way restrict that greater mass of goods. But the product of kodesh, the product of this consecrated wood, does not become nullified in any amount. Once we set something aside for a holy purpose, it remains holy, except in certain circumstances that we're going to talk about in a moment at the end of the show. And it remains holy, and there's nothing to do about it, and you can't nullify it in any proportion. Okay, so nullification is not going to be available. However, says Rava, and now I'm near the end, so if you have questions or comments, please put them in. Rava says, but actually, the person who kindled the fire with kodesh, right, with wood that was consecrated for use in the temple, when he kindles that fire, he is actually violating a specific halacha, a specific law, which prohibits misuse of temple property. He has appropriated temple property to himself. He violates a specific law when you misuse temple property. And at that point, says Rava, the wood actually loses its holiness, right? When he misappropriates it, even before he lights the fire, when he takes it for his own use, that wood is deconsecrated. Not nullified, but deconsecrated, according to Rava. And therefore, since it's no longer holy, the bread should be permitted, says Rava. Rav Papa answers him. He says, what are we talking about here? First of all, we're talking about wood that's set aside for a particular kind of offering, consecrated for a particular kind of offering in the temple, the shlamim, which are the peace offerings. Now, in the case of the peace offerings, some of the peace offering is going to be eaten. Okay, and so it's like an animal is brought. Some of it's going to be slaughtered in a kosher way. Some of it is going to be offered up on the altar and burned there. And some of it is going to go to the priests to eat. And the part that's going to go to the priests to eat, they're not going to eat raw meat. They're going to cook it. And so this wood is set aside for the priests to have a cooking fire for the portion of the peace offerings that is going to be for them to eat. The wood is consecrated, but it's not at the highest level of consecration as the wood that's going to actually be burned on the altar, for which there would be no cure. But with respect to this consecrated wood of a slightly lower level of holiness, there's going to be a distinction possible, which is that if the person who then misappropriates that wood for his own use, if he does it unintentionally, that's where this law kicks in, which deconsecrates the wood. Why? Because once he misappropriates it for himself, he didn't do it on purpose. It wasn't intentional. So then, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a cure for that. And the cure is he has to bring an offering, as we've seen in the case of Shabbos, right? When you violate Shabbos in some way unintentionally, so you become liable to bring a sin offering. He has to bring a sin offering. And he has to pay back the temple for the wood that he took from the temple, plus 20% because he appropriated some property of the temple. Once he does that, now this mechanism allows, he's made up for his unintentional sin, but also the holiness of that consecrated wood gets transferred to the money which he is giving to the temple, right? When you pay money to the temple, that money becomes consecrated with the 20% penalty because you use something that belongs to the temple. And then the temple will use that money to replace the wood so that the priests will have what to bake their portion of the peace offerings with. However, just as in the case of Shabbos, for an intentional violation, there is no offering that you can bring. You can atone by tefillah and teshuvah, maybe tzedakah, right? So you can atone for what you've done wrong, for your intentional sin, by prayer and by committing to atoning and not doing it again and giving to charity. But you can't bring an offering and pay the temple, and in which case that would become deconsecrated. Since you did it intentionally, that mechanism doesn't kick in. The wood never becomes deconsecrated, and it was consecrated wood that was in the oven, and any bread that was baked using consecrated wood for the heat will be prohibited and remain prohibited. Okay, that's what we've got today. Let us check questions and comments. Rochelle, I hung my first pomegranate in the shul's sukkah. So she's talking about the sukkah, which are the booths that we dwell in to eat and even sleep if possible during the fall festival holiday of Sukkot. And it's a fall holiday, a fall festival. And we often decorate the sukkah with produce of the fall, like the harvested fruits and vegetables can be used to decorate the sukkah. And she says, I hung my first pomegranate in the synagogue's sukkah, donated to Kohanim. Is that receiving benefits, first fruits dedicated to Kohanim? I mean, are you asking, can we benefit from giving the gift? I think that's what you must be saying. And so the question, so look, if the pomegranate was, for example, grown in a vineyard, which would be prohibited mixture, prohibited planting of diverse kinds, so the pomegranate is prohibited, and not only can we not benefit from it by giving it as a gift, but also the synagogue can't have that prohibited pomegranate, right? And nor could the Kohanim, the priests, enjoy it. If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think that's what the answer would be. Alicia asks, the vessels are destroyed. So there we're talking about if they're clay vessels that were formed using this fire. So here we seem to be distinguishing between an oven, even a new oven that was hardened, versus the clay vessels, let's say clay bowls, that were manufactured using this fire made of a prohibited substance. And it appears that those are prohibited and remain prohibited. I think I saw that halacha. Bowls, cups, and flasks. Bowls, cups, flasks, and pots that were formed using wood from an asherah, at least from the asherah, from the idolatrous tree, are prohibited in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi of Rebbe, as explained in the Gemara. What we might ask is, what about bowls and flasks that were lit, with a fire of a lower prohibition, right? Just, using peels of orla to kindle it. What about those bowls and flasks? That's a tougher question because maybe they're in the same category as the oven itself, a new oven, which we said we don't have to shatter that oven. So that's a good question. Linda says, in other words, the fire of the tree from idolatry does not get purified by fire, therefore contaminates everything used and produced as an offering. I wonder how the trees from Lebanon were used to build the Temple of Solomon. Were they not from a pagan contaminated country or land? How would the priests have consecrated this for building the temple? What a good question, Linda. What a good question. I mean, certainly they would not use a tree that they knew to have been worshipped in idolatry. It may be, that the area of Lebanon was not filled with Asherah worshippers, or somehow, maybe the trees that were worshipped in those ceremonies, it was known which trees they were. It wasn't just like a whole forest. They would actually, decorate those trees or make a clearing around the trees. There were places where they did the ceremonies. It wasn't like they worshiped all trees. It was, I think they chose certain trees. But if they had any reason to believe that a tree had so been used, then it's got to be that they would never allow that to be used in the construction of the temple. I haven't read that ruling, but I mean, I'm going to just go out on a limb, as it were, and say, no way would they have used a tree used in worship of Asherah in the construction of the temple. Linda asks, how did the Maccabees purify the temple after it was contaminated by pagans? Right, so that's an awesome question here in Hanukkah, right? So it's interesting because, so what was that war? That was a war, it was really a civil war between the Torah Jews and the kind of secular assimilated Jews who had joined, this Hellenized Greek culture. They stopped practicing circumcision. They stopped all, Jewish practice. And they were saying to their religious brothers and sisters, hey, leave that old superstitious religion behind. Join the modern civilized world and do like us. So Hanukkah is 100% about not assimilating into a greater secular godless culture. And that's why the ones who seemed like they were going to win the war, what they did is they went in the temple and they didn't smash all of the containers of oil that were used to light the menorah, right? The menorah's light would sort of emit into the whole world, be a light unto the nations. But the oil that was used in the candelabra of the temple, often we distinguish between a menorah and a Hanukkah because they look different, right? So the menorah is part of the national symbol of the modern state of Israel. It's a 7-branched candelabra, 3 on each side, 1 in the middle. Hanukkah, where we celebrate 8 nights and has the center one, which is a little higher usually, but is actually just used to light the other candles, is a 9-branched candelabra. So that's why we say menorahs about Hanukkah, but a better word is a Hanukkah, the candelabra of Hanukkah, right? But it was the candelabra of the temple, massive, gold affair that they would light with these big cups filled with oil, and they would burn all day, nice bright light. The oil that went into the menorah of the temple, the Hellenizers, they were Jews, so they understood. They at least had who to ask how they could, what was the word I'm looking for? How they could nullify that oil, how they could desecrate that oil. They didn't need to smash all the containers of oil, and in a sense, what they did was lazier and harsher. And what they did is they just broke all the seals, all the priests, all the seals of the high priest that were on the oils that were guaranteed pure. And when they broke those seals, they were desecrated and couldn't be used in the menorah. And so what they found was just one that had not been desecrated in that fashion. Now, if you're asking about like other things that they did, I think they did terrible things, brought in swine and at some point that was done. Maybe that was later, or maybe it was in the first temple, but definitely the destroyers of the temple did terrible things. But when you're talking about desecrating a room or even desecrating the altar, those things aren't made out of earthenware, right? They're made out of stone. And so presumably they could be washed, get all vestiges off, and then rededicated, right? And so Hanukkah is very much, and we read one of the Psalms that we read every day, and we read also at Hanukkah, is like what Hanukkah actually means is the dedication, right? So when somebody moves into a house, that's also called a Hanukkah, right? Where they dedicate the house when they install the mezuzah on the house. And so when they rededicated, first they cleaned up, and then basically they reconsecrated to undo the effects of that desecration that had stood there during that war and other kinds of events in history like that. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. You should be blessed with a beautiful Zois Hanukkah, the 8th day of Hanukkah. This is the day of miracles. If you need a miracle in your life, Your prayers have special power today, the 8th day of Hanukkah, the day that is beyond nature, when all barriers may be broken. You should have a beautiful Shabbos that comes in tonight. With God's help, we'll continue tomorrow discussing the question with respect to chametz, leaven on Passover. We've talked a lot about what happens when you burn other things. What about the chametz for Passover? Must it be burned or not? We've already heard the answer. It doesn't have to be burned, but why? And what else? What other interesting teachings are related to that? Tune in tomorrow after Shabbos, about an hour and a half to 2 hours after Shabbos ends in LA. So probably about 6:37 p.m. here. Or maybe even a little 7 or 7:30 p.m. Pacific. And that's it. And again, if you'd like to enable us to share Torah with the world, your tzedakah dollars, your charity dollars go a long way with our nonprofit. We're about halfway through our annual campaign, and you can take us further in that. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, and that also will enable you to dedicate one of the episodes of this show. All the best. Hanukkah Sameach. And good Shabbos.